My name is Nessa Morrow. I'm 31 years old. And for most of my life I was the family joke. Not the kind of joke people laugh about and move on from. The kind that gets repeated at dinner tables, at holiday gatherings, at birthday parties until it stops being a joke and starts being the only thing anyone believes about you. The useless one. That's what they called me. Not behind my back. To my face. In front of guests. In front of my teachers. Once, in front of my 7th grade boyfriend who never called me again after that dinner. My father, Philip Morrow, said it the way other fathers say, she's our artist, or she's the athletic one. He said it like it was simply true, like it was a fact as verifiable as my height or my blood type, like he had run the numbers and come to a reasonable conclusion. Nessa is the useless one. What he didn't know was that while he was busy writing me off, I was watching, burning, building. And on the morning a Charlotte Business Journal reporter called my father to ask for a comment about his daughter's 8-figure net worth. I was sitting in a corner office 40 miles away, drinking coffee and waiting for exactly that phone call to happen. If you've ever been the one your family gave up on, if you've ever sat at a table full of people who share your last name and felt completely invisible, stay with me. Because this story is for you. And trust me, it gets a whole lot better before it's done. And if you want more stories like this one, make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on, because we tell these stories every single week. The Morrows were not old money, but they wanted everyone to believe they were. My father had built Morrow Fabrication Solutions, a mid-sized industrial manufacturing company headquartered in Charlotte, North Carolina, over the course of 22 years. By the time I was 10 years old, the company employed over 300 people and had contracts with 2 of the largest automotive suppliers in the Southeast. My father wore that success like a crown. Everything in our house, the 6-bedroom colonial in Myers Park, the membership at the Carmel Country Club, the annual family trip to Hilton Head, existed to announce one thing. Philip Morrow had made it. He had 2 children. My older brother, Colton, who was 4 years ahead of me and golden in every sense of the word. Tall, charismatic, a natural in front of people, the kind of kid whose teachers remembered him fondly decades later. And then there was me. Nessa. Quieter. Slower to speak in groups. More interested in numbers and systems than in conversation. I was the child who sat in the corner at parties and mentally calculated how much the catering company was probably charging per head. I was the child who reorganized the family's bookkeeping spreadsheets at age 13 just because I noticed they weren't tracking vendor costs correctly. My father's response when he found out was not pride. It was suspicion. He asked me who helped me do it. When I told him no one, he told me not to touch things that didn't belong to me. That was the year the label started. Not officially, not with ceremony, but in the small, grinding way that labels always begin in families. Accoumoir. A comparison there. Colton's already talking about pre-law, you know. What does Nessa want to do? Nobody really knows. She's not really a, he'd pause searching for the word, a builder. Not like Colton. Not like me. My mother, Diane, was a soft-spoken woman who had spent 30 years smoothing over my father's harder edges. She wasn't cruel. But she was compliant. She would offer a small smile after those comments, touch my arm gently and say nothing. Her silence was its own kind of message. By the time I was 15, the family's operating assumption was firmly in place. Colton would eventually take over Morrow Fabrication. Colton would carry the name forward. Colton would be the one who mattered in the long run. I was to be managed, kept presentable, kept quiet, steered toward something modest and appropriate. My father once suggested with complete sincerity that I look into becoming a dental hygienist. Not a dentist. A hygienist. He said it would be stable. Reliable. Something I could actually handle. I was 15 years old and I had just gotten the highest grade in my sophomore honors economics class. I didn't argue. I had already learned by then that arguing with Philip Morrow produced nothing except a longer version of the same speech. So I nodded and went back to my room and opened the business biography I was reading, the 3rd one that month, and kept going. The person who saw me clearly during those years was my maternal grandmother, Ruthen Okafor. She had been born in Greensboro, raised in a family of school teachers, and had married my grandfather at 22 before eventually running the administrative side of his small printing business for 4 decades. She was not a wealthy woman. She was not a powerful woman in the way my father used that word. But she was one of the sharpest people I have ever known, and she loved me with the kind of steadiness that didn't require anything from me in return. Every other Saturday I would take the bus to her apartment in Plaza Midwood, and we would sit at her kitchen table for hours. She would make chicory coffee and ask me what I had been reading, what I had been thinking about, what problems I had noticed that nobody else seemed to be paying attention to. She never once asked me about my grades. She never once compared me to Colton. She asked me what I saw. "You've got a mind like a trap, Nessa," she told me once when I was 16 and had just walked her through an analysis I had done of our school district's budget allocation, which I had found publicly available online and spent a weekend pulling apart. Not the kind that catches things. The kind that doesn't let things go until it understands them completely. That's rarer than you think, baby. Don't let your father's noise drown that out. I held on to those words like a rope. High school ended. Colton went to UNC Chapel Hill on a partial scholarship and joined the business fraternity and called home every Sunday. I was accepted to NC State, where I enrolled in the College of Management. No celebration dinner. No toast. My father handed me a check for the first semester's tuition and told me not to waste it on something impractical. When I told him I was majoring in finance and accounting with a minor in data analytics, he asked me if I was sure I could handle the math. I told him yes. He looked unconvinced. College was the first time in my life that the environment matched the way my brain worked. I was not the loudest person in any room. I was still quiet, still more comfortable with systems than with small talk. But for the first time, quiet wasn't a liability. My professors didn't need me to perform. They needed me to think. And thinking was the one thing nobody had ever been able to take from me. I graduated in 3.5 years with a 3.91 GPA. Magna cum laude. I accepted a position as a junior financial analyst at a regional private equity firm in Charlotte called Century Capital Group. The starting salary was $64,000 a year. I did not tell my father the name of the firm until after I had already accepted the offer, because I knew what he would say. He said it anyway when I told him at Christmas. Private equity. He repeated the words slowly, like he was tasting something unfamiliar. You sure they know what they're getting? You sure you're ready for something that competitive? I told him yes and passed the bread rolls. What I didn't tell him was that I had already spent 6 months preparing for that role before I walked through the door. I had spent every weekend for half a year reading deal memos, studying valuation models, building my own mock analysis reports on publicly available company financials just to train my eye. I showed up to that job not as a junior analyst who needed hand-holding. I showed up as someone who had already been doing the work in private for months. Within 8 months, I had flagged a valuation discrepancy in a mid-market manufacturing deal that saved the firm from a significant overpayment. My managing director, a composed and exacting woman named Gail Sutherland, pulled me into her office afterward and asked me how I had caught it. I told her I had been running parallel models on every deal we touched off the clock, just to see where the gaps were. She looked at me for a long moment and said quietly and without fanfare, "Don't stop doing that." I didn't stop. That was the beginning. Not the end of anything. Not the dramatic turning point yet. Just the first real moment when the world outside my family reflected something back at me that felt true. I was not the useless one. I had never been the useless one. I was the one they hadn't bothered to look at closely enough. But Philip Morrow was still at the head of the table back in Myers Park, still introducing Colton at the Carmel Country Club as the future of the family name, still telling people at dinner parties that Nessa was doing something in finance. He wasn't exactly sure what, in that easy dismissive tone that made it sound like whatever I was doing was barely worth tracking. He had no idea what was coming. And I wasn't ready to tell him yet. 3 years into my time at Century Capital Group, I had stopped being the junior analyst who needed to prove herself and had become something the firm quietly depended on without fully acknowledging it. I ran the numbers on every Southeast deal that came through the door. I built the models. I stress-tested the assumptions. When senior partners walked into pitch meetings, they were walking in with my work under their arms, wearing it like it was theirs. I didn't mind. Not yet. I was learning, and learning was the only currency I cared about in those years. What I was also doing, quietly and without telling a single person at the office, was saving. Not in the casual way most people in their mid-20s save, putting aside whatever's left after rent and groceries. I was saving with the kind of discipline that made my roommate at the time, a graphic designer named Priya, call me terrifying in a tone that was only half joking. I had a budget that I built every January and reviewed every quarter. I cooked almost every meal I ate. I drove a 2009 Honda Civic that I had bought outright for $6,200. I wore the same rotation of work clothes for 2 years until they started to fray. Every dollar that was not allocated to a necessary expense went into a brokerage account that I managed myself, running analysis on every position the same way I ran analysis at work. By the time I was 26, I had saved and invested just over $190,000 on a salary that had grown to $81,000 after 2 raises. People who hear that number always ask the same question. How? The answer is not interesting or glamorous. The answer is that I made a decision in my early 20s that my future self was more important than my present comfort, and I did not renegotiate that decision every time something tempting appeared in my peripheral vision. My family had no idea. Thanksgiving that year was at my parents' house in Myers Park. The kitchen smelled like it always did: roasted turkey, sweet potatoes, the particular brand of tension that came with any room containing both Philip Morrow and an audience. Colton had brought his girlfriend, a cheerful woman named Britt who laughed at everything my father said. My father had spent the better part of the afternoon walking Colton through his plan to bring him into Morrow Fabrication as director of operations the following spring. He had not asked me how work was going until we were nearly finished with dessert, and even then it came out as a throwaway line dropped between bites of pecan pie. "Nessa, you still doing that finance thing?" I told him yes. He nodded slowly, the way people nod when they're already thinking about something else. "Oh good. Better than nothing." He looked at Colton with the full warmth he had never once directed at me. "Real responsibility. Real stakes. That's where you learn what you're made of." I looked at my mother across the table. She was smoothing her napkin in her lap. She did not look up. The drive home was 40 minutes. I spent all 40 of them not angry. Anger had stopped being useful to me somewhere around age 17, but recalibrating. The feeling I had learned to work with by then was something colder and more functional than anger. It was clarity. My father believed the story he had written about me so completely that new evidence didn't register. That was not a problem I could solve by trying harder to be seen. The only thing that was ever going to change that story was scale. Numbers so large and so public that not even Philip Morrow could look away. So I accelerated. The opportunity that changed everything came through a contact I had made at a conference in Atlanta the previous spring. Her name was Simone Achterberg, and she was 34 years old and had already built and sold one software company and was 2 years into building a second one. The second company was a supply chain analytics platform called Veridian Systems, targeting mid-market manufacturers who were hemorrhaging money on logistics inefficiencies their fragmented data infrastructure couldn't surface. When Simone walked me through the product at a hotel bar over a conversation that stretched 3 hours, I felt something I hadn't felt since I was 13 years old reorganizing my father's spreadsheets. Recognition. I knew exactly what this product was solving because I had watched my father's company bleed from precisely those inefficiencies for years without anyone at Morrow Fabrication having the tools to diagnose it. I called Simone 2 weeks later and asked if she was still raising her seed round. She said she had 1 slot left. I asked how much. She said $75,000 minimum. I told her I needed 10 days. I spent those 10 days doing the most thorough due diligence of my life. I pulled every comparable company I could find. I modeled the addressable market 3 different ways. I stress-tested the unit economics until I was satisfied they held. And then I wired Simone Achterberg $75,000 from the brokerage account I had spent 4 years building, and I did not tell a single person I had done it. Not Priya. Not Gail Sutherland. Not my mother. Definitely not my father. That was the bet. Placed alone, the way I had done everything that mattered in my life. Without an audience, without permission, without anyone telling me I was capable enough to try. The 18 months that followed were quiet and incremental and, from the outside, completely invisible. I kept showing up at Sentry Capital. Simone sent investor updates every 60 days and I read every word on Sunday mornings with my coffee. The numbers were moving. Slowly at first, then with more confidence. Veridian signed its first enterprise client at month 7. Its second and third at month 11. By month 14 Simone had been approached by 2 strategic acquirers and turned both of them down. At month 18 she called me on a Tuesday evening while I was eating leftover pasta at my kitchen counter. She said without any preamble, "I'm raising a Series A. Your stake is going to be repriced. You should sit down." I was already sitting. He told me the number. The valuation implied that my $75,000 had become, on paper, just over $1.1 million. I sat in my kitchen for a long time after we hung up without moving. Not because I was shocked exactly. I had run the math. I had believed in the model. But there is a difference between believing something intellectually and feeling it arrive in your life as a real and solid thing. I had grown up being told, in every register available to a parent, that I was not the kind of person who built things of value. Sitting in that kitchen in the apartment I had furnished from estate sales and Facebook Marketplace, eating pasta in a work shirt I had owned for 6 years, I understood something I hadn't been able to articulate before. The people who told me what I was worth had never actually looked. I did not call my parents that night. I made a note in the spreadsheet where I tracked my net worth, updated the number, closed the laptop and went to bed. The following spring, Gail Sutherland called me into her office and told me a managing partner slot was opening up and that she was recommending me for consideration. I thanked her. And then I went home and spent the weekend thinking about something entirely different, which was whether I actually wanted to be a managing partner at Century Capital at all. I was 27. I had a 7-figure paper gain in a company growing faster than anyone had originally projected. I had 4 years of deal experience that had taught me exactly how the game was played. And I had an idea I had been quietly developing in the margins of notebooks for over a year. A boutique advisory firm, small and deliberately so, built to serve mid-market manufacturing companies in the Southeast. Companies too large to operate without sophisticated financial guidance but too small to afford the fees the major firms charged. I had watched these companies get underserved my entire career. I had watched deals collapse not because the underlying businesses were weak but because the financial infrastructure around them was inadequate. I knew this world. I had grown up in it at a dinner table where a man who ran exactly this kind of company had looked at me my entire life and seen nothing. I thought about that a great deal during those weeks. About how the industry my father had spent his life building was the exact industry I understood better than almost anyone I had met at Century Capital. Not because of any advantage he had given me. Because of everything he hadn't. Because I had spent 20 years watching from the outside with nothing to do but pay attention. I wrote the business plan in 6 weeks. I gave Gail my notice on a Thursday morning. She looked at me for a long moment and said, "I was wondering when you were going to do this. I want to be your first client referral." I walked out of that building and stood on the sidewalk in the cold March air and felt for the first time in a long time that the life I was living was fully mine. Not assigned to me. Not what was left over after everyone else took their share. Mine, built from scratch on my own terms. My father still had no idea what I had been building. And I intended to keep it that way for a little while longer. What I hadn't anticipated was how disorienting it would feel to walk away from the only professional identity I had built. For 4 years, Century Capital had been the scaffolding around which I organized my days. The first 2 weeks after I handed in my badge, I woke up at 5:47 a.m., the exact same time I had woken up for 4 years, and lay in the silence of my apartment with nothing scheduled and reminded myself that this was the point. I had built the runway. Now I had to learn how to run. I named the firm Iron Gate Advisory. The name came to me at 2 in the morning on a Wednesday, scribbled on the back of a gas station receipt I found in my jacket pocket. Iron for durability. Gate for access. The idea that the companies I wanted to serve deserved a door into the kind of financial thinking that had always been reserved for businesses 10 times their size. I liked that it didn't sound soft. I liked that it didn't sound like me, or at least not the version of me my family had always described. Nessa Morrow, founder of Iron Gate Advisory. I said it out loud in my empty apartment just to hear how it landed. It landed well. The first 6 months were harder than I had anticipated and easier than I had feared, which is probably the most honest way to describe starting anything real. Gail Sutherland sent me 2 referrals in the first month, both mid-sized fabrication companies in the Piedmont region that had been underserved by their previous advisors and were hemorrhaging margin in ways their owners could feel but not locate. I found the sources within the first 2 weeks on both engagements. One was a procurement cycle inefficiency that had been compounding quietly for 3 years. The other was a pricing model that hadn't been updated since 2017 and was leaving nearly 8% gross margin on the table on every contract renewal. In both cases, the business owners looked at my analysis the way people look at something they already knew somewhere deep down but hadn't had the language to say out loud. That expression, recognition mixed with relief, became the thing I worked toward on every engagement. Word moved fast in that world. Faster than I expected. Manufacturing is an industry built on relationships and referrals, and the Piedmont region of North Carolina is, Despite its economic scale, a surprisingly small community of people who all know each other and talk. By month 4 I had 5 active clients. By month 7 I had 11. I hired my first employee, a meticulous and unflappable analyst named Dex Okafor. No relation to my grandmother, though I took it as a good sign, who had been working at a regional accounting firm and was tired of doing tax prep for people who didn't want to understand their own numbers. He was 24, fast, and had the rare quality of being genuinely comfortable saying out loud when he didn't know something. I valued that more than almost anything else in a person. Viridian Systems continued its climb in the background of all of this. Simone had closed the Series A at a valuation that made my original stake look almost comically underpriced in retrospect. She was now in conversations with a strategic partner in the logistics sector, and the investor updates had taken on a different tone. Tighter, more deliberate, the language of someone who knows an exit is somewhere on the visible horizon and is managing toward it carefully. I monitored it the way I monitored everything important, steadily and without drama, updating my net worth spreadsheet every quarter with the same mechanical consistency I had maintained since I was 23. My personal life during this period was, by most conventional measures, unremarkable. I had moved from the apartment I had shared with Priya into a one-bedroom in Noida, Charlotte's Arts District, that I had found through a client whose property management company handled the building. The apartment had original hardwood floors and a window in the kitchen that faced east, and I drank my coffee in front of it every morning before the rest of the neighborhood was awake. I was not seeing anyone seriously. I had a small and carefully maintained circle of friends, most of them people I had met through work over the years, people who talked about ideas as readily as they talked about their weekends. I was not lonely. I was, for perhaps the first time in my adult life, genuinely content, which is a quieter and more durable feeling than happy, and one that I had not expected to arrive without fanfare. What was not quiet was the situation developing inside Morrow Fabrication Solutions 40 miles away in Myers Park. I learned about it not from my father or my brother, but from a client of mine named Stuart Beal, who ran a mid-sized tooling company in Kannapolis that supplied components to 3 of Morrow Fabrication's primary product lines. Stuart mentioned it the way people mention things they assume you already know. Casually at the end of a meeting as he was putting on his jacket. Heard your family's company is having a rough quarter. Supply chain issues, I think. Something about a contract falling through with one of their Southeast distributors. I kept my expression neutral and told him I appreciated the heads up. Then I drove home and spent the evening pulling everything publicly available on Morrow Fabrication's financials that I could find. What I found was not a disaster, but it was a warning signal that anyone with trained eyes would have caught immediately. The distributor contract Stuart mentioned had represented roughly 19% of Morrow Fabrication's annual revenue. Losing it hadn't broken the company, but it had created a liquidity gap that my father appeared to be managing by drawing down a line of credit he had established in 2019. The interest rate on that line was not favorable. The repayment timeline he appeared to be working with was optimistic in a way that only made sense if he secured a replacement contract within the next 18 months. Based on what I could see about the competitive landscape in their product categories, that timeline was aggressive. I sat with that information for 3 days before I decided what to do with it, which was nothing. It was not my company. I had never been invited to have an opinion about it, and I had stopped waiting for that invitation years ago. If my father wanted financial guidance, he knew where to find advisors. That he hadn't thought to call me was not a surprise. It was simply consistent. What was harder to sit with was the phone call I got from my mother on a Friday evening in November. Diane Morrow was not a woman who called to talk about problems. She was a woman who called to check in, to report that the hydrangeas were doing well or that she and my father had seen a good film. So when she called on a Friday and went quiet for a full 3 seconds after I said hello, I knew something had shifted. She didn't mention the company directly. She talked around it in the careful way she had always talked around anything that required her to acknowledge that things were not entirely fine. Your father has been under a lot of stress. He's not sleeping well. I think he's worried about some business things. She paused. Colton is trying to help, but it's all very complicated. Another pause. I just wanted to hear your voice. I told her I was glad she called. I asked about the hydrangeas. She told me they had done well this year. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular, and when I hung up I sat for a long time in the kitchen with the phone on the counter in front of me, thinking about what it meant that she had called and what she had been trying to say underneath everything she had actually said. She had been trying to tell me they were struggling. She had not been able to ask for help directly because asking me directly would have required her to acknowledge that I was someone worth asking, and 20 years of silence is a hard thing to reverse in a single phone call. I understood that. I did not feel triumphant about it. What I felt was something closer to grief. That particular kind that arrives not when something ends but when you finally stop expecting it to become something it never was. The following week I got a different kind of call entirely. This one came from a number I didn't recognize, a 704 area code, and the man on the other end introduced himself as Warren Grell, a business journalist at the Charlotte Business Journal who was working on a feature piece about emerging financial advisory firms in the Southeast. Someone had passed my name along, he said, and he was hoping to set up a time to talk about Irongate Advisory and what we had built over the past 2 years. I agreed to a 30-minute call the following Thursday. That call lasted 2 hours. Warren Grell was the kind of journalist who listened more than he talked, which is the rarest and most dangerous kind because you end up saying more than you planned. By the end of the conversation he had asked me about the firm's client base, our growth trajectory, our approach to mid-market manufacturing and, almost as an afterthought near the end, whether I had a personal connection to the industry. I told him I had grown up around it. He asked what that meant. I gave him a version of the truth, short and carefully worded, that my father ran a manufacturing company in Charlotte and that the industry was in my blood before it was ever in my resume. He thanked me for my time. He said the piece would run in the next issue. I thanked him back and thought nothing more about it. I did not think about what Warren Grell might find when he started pulling the background research that journalists always pull. I did not think about what it might mean for someone to Google Morrow Fabrication Solutions and find the same financial signals I had found and then Google Nessa Morrow and find Irongate Advisory and start doing the math. I did not think about any of that. I just went back to work. My father found out before the issue even hit print. Philip Morrow called me on a Sunday morning at 8:43. I know the exact time because I had just set my coffee down on the kitchen counter and my phone was face up on the table, and I watched his name appear on the screen for 3 full rings before I answered. My father did not call me on Sunday mornings. My father barely called me at all. When he did, it was usually to relay information through my mother first. Diane would call, establish that I was alive and employed, and then hand the phone to him for a 40-second exchange that felt like a quarterly earnings report with all the interesting numbers removed. A direct call at 8:43 on a Sunday meant something had already happened. I answered. He didn't say hello. He said, I got a call from someone at the Charlotte Business Journal last night. A reporter. He was asking questions about you. I waited. About your company. About your, he paused and I could hear him choosing the word carefully, your finances. Kept my voice even. What kind of questions? The kind where they already know the answers and they're checking if you'll confirm them. His voice had a quality I had never heard in it before, or at least never heard directed at me. It was tight. Controlled in the way that things are controlled when significant effort is being applied to keep them that way. He asked me if I knew you had invested in a tech company 2 years ago. He said the stake is worth something. He said the word substantial. I told him I wasn't aware the reporter had contacted him. That was true. Warren Grell had not mentioned reaching out to my father, and I hadn't anticipated it, though in retrospect I should have. A profile piece on a founder with a family connection to a struggling competitor in the same industry. Of course he was going to make that call. So it's true. My father's voice dropped half a register. You have money. Real money. I told him yes. How much? I told him I wasn't going to discuss the specific number over the phone. A silence followed that lasted long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Then he said, why didn't you tell us? And I sat with that question for a moment because it was the wrong question, asked in the wrong tone, by someone who had not yet understood why it was the wrong question. I didn't tell you because it wasn't your business, I said. I built it on my own. You weren't involved in any part of it and I didn't need you to be. Another silence. Longer this time. He said, I see, in the voice of a man who did not see it all, and then he said he had to go and he hung up. I finished my coffee standing at the kitchen counter. I was not shaking. I was not elated. I felt the particular stillness that comes after something you have been quietly bracing for finally arrives and turns out to be exactly as heavy as you expected, no more and no less. The article ran on Thursday. I knew because 3 separate clients forwarded it to me before 9 in the morning, each with a variation of the same message. Congratulations, we had no idea, this is incredible. The piece was generous and thorough. Warren Grell had done his research. He covered Irongate Advisory's founding, our client roster which he described only in aggregate terms per my request, our growth rate, and the Viridian investment, which he had independently verified through public filings from the Series A disclosure. He had also, with my approval, included one paragraph about my background. It read simply that I had grown up in a manufacturing family in Charlotte, had worked in private equity before founding Irongate, and had built the firm without outside capital or institutional backing. He did not mention my father by name. He did not need to. Anyone in Charlotte's business community who read that paragraph and knew anything about the Morrow family would connect the dots in under 30 seconds. The piece ran under the headline, "The Quiet Builder: How Nessa Morrow Turned a $64,000 analyst salary into an 8-figure net worth Without Anyone Noticing." 8 figures. Seeing it in print was its own particular kind of strange. Not because the number surprised me. I had been watching it accumulate in my spreadsheet for years, one careful quarter at a time. But because there is something about a number becoming public that changes its shape. It stops being a private fact and becomes a statement. And this statement had been made in the same city where my father had been telling people for 2 decades that I was the one who hadn't amounted to much. My phone did not stop for 48 hours. Colleagues. Former Sentry Capital analysts who had never once reached out. Extended family members whose names I had to look up in my contacts to remember. A cousin who had been at the Thanksgiving table 8 years ago when my father told Colton he was the future of the family name sent me a voice message that was 45 seconds of breathless congratulations. I listened to it once and did not respond. The call that mattered came Wednesday evening, the day before the piece ran, which meant someone had gotten an early copy. It was Colton. My brother and I had maintained what I would describe as a functional distance over the years. We were not estranged, we were not close, we existed in the same family the way 2 people can share a building without ever being in the same room. He was not a cruel person. He was a person who had been handed so much approval for so long that he had never needed to develop the muscle that gets built when you have to fight for it. I did not blame him for that. But I had also stopped expecting very much from him. He opened with something I hadn't expected. He said, "I owe you an apology." I told him he didn't have to do this. He said he did actually and that he had been thinking about it for longer than I knew. He said he remembered the Thanksgiving dinner when he was 25 and I was 21, the one where our father had suggested I look into becoming a dental hygienist while I was sitting across the table with a 3.9 GPA and a declared finance major. He said he had laughed. Not loudly, but he had laughed and he had never said anything, and that had sat with him in a way he hadn't known how to address until now. I listened to him without interrupting. When he finished I told him I appreciated him saying it. I told him I didn't need an apology to move forward, but that I was glad he had called. He asked if we could get dinner sometime, just the 2 of us, no parents. I told him yes. We settled on a date 2 weeks out, and when I hung up I sat quietly for a moment and thought about how strange it is that the people who owe us the most are often the ones who figure it out the latest. Not because they're bad people but because they never had a reason to look before. The harder conversation came Friday morning. My mother showed up at my apartment unannounced at 10:15. I buzzed her up because I was not the kind of person who let their mother stand in a lobby, whatever history existed between us. She came in and stood in my kitchen looking at the east-facing window and the hardwood floors and the bookshelves I had built myself from lumber and brackets I had bought at the hardware store 2 years ago. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "You built all of this yourself?" I told her yes. He said I didn't know. And I told her, gently but directly, that she hadn't asked. She sat down at my kitchen table and I made coffee because it was something to do with my hands. She told me she had read the article 3 times. She told me she had cried, which I believed because her eyes were still slightly swollen at the edges. She said she was not crying because she was proud, though she was, but because she was ashamed. Not of me, of herself. She said she had told herself for years that staying quiet was a form of neutrality, that by not joining in when my father dismissed me she was somehow not participating. She said the article had made her understand that silence is not neutral. Silence is a choice. And she had made it over and over again for 20 years. I did not rush to reassure her. I let the words sit in the room between us because they deserved to sit there. Then I told her what I needed to tell her, which was that I wasn't interested in relitigating the past but that I was also not going to pretend it hadn't happened. That if she wanted a real relationship with me going forward, it would have to be built on honesty, and that would require her to stop managing information to keep the peace and start saying what was actually true. She nodded. She said she understood. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine the way she used to when I was very small, before everything calcified into what it became. I let her keep it there. That was the beginning of something, though I was careful not to call it more than that yet. My father had still not called back. I had not called him either. That silence had a different texture than all the silences that had come before it. The previous ones had been his. This one was shared. And I was in no hurry to end it before I was ready. 2 weeks after the article ran, I got a call from a number I recognized immediately. It was Raymond Kessler, my father's oldest business partner and the man who had co-signed the original lease on Morrow Fabrication's first facility back in 1998. Raymond was 71 years old, semi-retired, and had the reputation of someone who said exactly what he meant on the first attempt and never felt the need to repeat himself. He and my father had known each other for 30 years. He had attended my high school graduation and given me a card with $50 in it and a handshake that lasted approximately 1 second. He was not a warm man. But he was an honest one, and in my experience those two qualities rarely arrive together, which made him worth listening to when he called. He did not ease into it. He said, "Your father asked me to reach out." I told him I noticed he hadn't called himself. Raymond said, "Yes, well, that's something of the point." He told me that Philip had read the article and that the article had done something to him that Raymond had not seen in 30 years of friendship, which was that it had made him genuinely quiet. Not the performative quiet of a man collecting himself before a counterargument. The other kind. The kind that arrives when something lands in a place where a person has no prepared response because they had never considered the possibility of needing one. Raymond said my father wanted to meet. Not at the house, not on his territory, somewhere neutral. He suggested a restaurant called Hartwell's in Dilworth, a neighborhood neither of us had a particular claim to, the following Saturday at noon. I told Raymond I would think about it. He said, "Nessa, I've known your father a long time. I've watched him do a lot of things I thought were wrong and kept my mouth shut because it wasn't my place." He paused. "This is me not keeping my mouth shut. Go to the lunch." I went. Hartwell's was the kind of place that existed between formal and casual. Linen napkins, no tablecloths, good light through wide windows. I arrived 7 minutes early out of habit and was shown to a corner table. My father arrived 4 minutes later, which was also out of character. Philip Morrow was a man who arrived exactly on time to everything because arriving early suggested eagerness and arriving late suggested disrespect, and both were, in his framework, weaknesses. Arriving early to this lunch meant something. I filed it away. He looked older than he had at Christmas. Not dramatically, but in the specific way that stress ages people from the inside out. Something behind the eyes that wasn't quite tiredness and wasn't quite worry but lived in the neighborhood of both. He sat down. He did not extend his hand. We were past that particular formality by now. He picked up the menu and looked at it for a moment and then set it down without having read it, which told me he had not come to eat. He said, "I read the article 4 times. I told him Warren Grell was a thorough reporter. He said that wasn't what he meant. I waited. He said, "I read it and I kept waiting for the part where I was wrong about you. Where the explanation was that someone had helped you or that the numbers were inflated, or that the situation was more complicated than it appeared. I kept looking for the reason it made sense." He stopped. And it just kept being what it was. I told him I understood. He shook his head slightly. "I don't think you do. I don't think you understand what it feels like to read something like that and realize that every assumption you built your understanding of a person on was not just wrong but was wrong in a direction that reflects on you. That the gap between what I thought and what was true is not a small miscalculation. It is 20 years of a story I told myself because it was easier than looking. I did not help him. I did not say it was all right or that he shouldn't be too hard on himself or any of the things people say to make discomfort shorter. I let him sit in it because sitting in it was the honest thing and I had spent 20 years being asked to make dishonesty comfortable for him and I was done doing that. He said, "I called you the useless one. Not just at home." He looked at the table. "At the club. At industry events. I used it like it was a personality description. Like it was just a thing that was true about you." His voice had the particular flatness of a man reciting something he has rehearsed and found no way to soften. "I want you to know that I know what that cost you. I can't quantify it and I'm not going to try. But I know it cost you something." The waiter came. We ordered without discussing it, both of us choosing something simple and neither of us particularly interested in the food. When the waiter left, my father said, "I need to ask you something." I told him to go ahead. He said Morrow Fabrication is in trouble. Not terminal trouble but real trouble. The distributor contract we lost in the spring was larger than I let on publicly, and Colton has been doing his best, but his best in this situation is not enough because the problem is financial and financial is not where Colton is strong. I already knew this. I told him I was aware the company had some headwinds. He looked at me directly for the first time since he had sat down. I'm not asking for money, Nessa. I want to be clear about that. I don't want your money and I am not here to ask you to save something I built by dismissing you. He said it with a steadiness that told me he had decided this before he walked in and had needed to say it early so it was established. What I'm asking is whether you would be willing to look at it. Not to fix it. Not to take it over. Just to look at it and tell me honestly what you see, because the people I have around me right now either don't understand the numbers or are telling me what I want to hear, and I cannot afford either of those things right now. I looked at my father across that table, this man who had organized 20 years of dinner conversations around the premise that I had nothing to offer, and I thought about what my grandmother Ruthann would say if she were sitting next to me. I thought about what she had said to me at her kitchen table when I was 16, about the kind of mind that doesn't let things go until it understands them completely. I thought about the fact that Morrow Fabrication employed 340 people who had nothing to do with anything my father had ever said about me, people who had mortgages and children in school and reasons to need that company to survive that had no relationship to the Morrow family's internal history. I told him I would look at it. Not as a favor and not as a reconciliation gesture. As a professional engagement with a clear scope, a defined timeline, and a fee structure consistent with what I charged every other client. He nodded immediately, which told me he had been prepared for that condition and had decided in advance that he would accept it. He said fair. I said I'll have Dex put together an engagement letter by Wednesday. He said all right. We ate. We talked about very little of consequence for the rest of the lunch. He asked about the Noda apartment and I told him it had good light. He told me Raymond's wife had been unwell and that he had been meaning to visit more. Small things. The kinds of things that fill the space between two people who are not yet sure what they are to each other and are being careful not to name it prematurely. When we stood to leave, he put on his coat and then stopped. He said, I should have seen you. His voice was flat and precise in the way it gets when someone is working very hard to say something accurately. I had every opportunity and I didn't take them, and I don't have a good explanation for that. That doesn't reduce to something I'm not proud of. He paused. I'm not asking you to forgive me today. I understand that's not how it works. I just needed you to hear me say it directly. I told him I heard him. He nodded once, the way he nodded when a meeting had concluded and its terms were established. Then he walked out ahead of me because old habits do not dissolve over a single lunch, and I followed at my own pace because neither do I. Dex had the engagement letter ready by Tuesday. I sent it Wednesday morning. My father's assistant returned the signed copy by end of day. I started the preliminary review of Morrow Fabrication's financials on Thursday evening, sitting at my kitchen table in front of the east-facing window with a glass of water and a legal pad, the same way I had started every serious analysis of my professional life. The numbers were exactly what I had expected from my earlier review. Not catastrophic, but serious, and getting more serious in a way that had a clear endpoint if the trajectory didn't change. I worked until midnight. I filled 6 pages of the legal pad with observations, questions, and the early shape of what I thought could be done. When I finally closed the laptop, I sat in the quiet of the apartment and thought about how strange and specifically human it is that the work a person dismisses you for can become the exact work they eventually come to need from you. Not as poetic justice. Just as the ordinary way that time has of making certain things undeniable. I was not doing this for my father. I was doing it for the 340 people who worked for him who had never dismissed me at all. The Morrow Fabrication engagement took 11 weeks. I want to be precise about that because people tend to imagine these kinds of things as either faster or slower than they actually are, and the reality was 11 weeks of methodical, unglamorous work that looked from the outside like very little and felt from the inside like rebuilding the load-bearing wall of a house while the family was still living in it. Dex and I reviewed 4 years of financials. We interviewed 7 department heads. We mapped every vendor relationship, every contract structure, every line of credit, every revenue concentration risk. We built 3 scenario models representing the company's trajectory under different strategic responses and presented all 3 to my father and Colton in a conference room at Morrow Fabrication's headquarters on a Tuesday morning in February. Colton sat across from me at that table and I watched him follow the analysis in real time, his expression shifting from polite attention to genuine engagement to something I recognized as the specific discomfort of understanding a problem clearly for the first time. He asked good questions. Better than I expected. He had been working at the company for 3 years and he knew the operational side with a depth I didn't have. And when he pushed back on one of my assumptions about the production cycle timeline, he was right and I told him so. That exchange, two people across a table correcting each other's work without either of them making it personal, was the closest my brother and I had ever come to actually working together, and it happened inside the company my father had built entirely around the idea that only one of us was capable. My father sat at the head of the table and said very little. He listened. He took notes on a yellow legal pad in the small cramped handwriting I had known since childhood. When I presented the recommended path forward, a combination of contract renegotiation with 2 anchor clients, a refinancing of the existing credit line at better terms I had already pre-negotiated with a regional lender, and a targeted reduction of overhead in 2 departments that had been overstaffed since 2021, he asked one question. He said, "If we do all of this, what does the company look like in 3 years?" I told him stable, leaner, and positioned to grow if the regional manufacturing market continued its current trajectory. He nodded. "Is it all right? Let's do it." He did not say thank you in that room. He said it 6 weeks later in a phone call on a Sunday evening, after the credit refinancing had closed and the first renegotiated contract had been signed and something in the numbers had visibly shifted in the direction of survivable. He called and said, "I wanted to let you know the bank confirmed the refinancing this morning. And I wanted to say separately that I know what you did and I know what it cost you to do it and I am grateful." His voice was even, controlled. But it was real in a way that his voice hadn't always been with me, and I took it as what it was, which was a man doing his best with the tools he had late but doing it. I told him I was glad it was working. He said, "Raymond told me something once that I didn't understand at the time." He said the most expensive thing in business is underestimating the person across the table. He paused. "I've been paying that cost for 30 years with you and I didn't know it." I did not fill the silence that followed. I let him have it. Then I said I had to get back to work, which was true, and we said goodbye, and that was the most my father and I had ever said to each other about what had happened between us. It was not enough to undo 20 years. It was not designed to. It was one honest conversation in a series that would need to keep happening for a long time before anything could reasonably be called repaired. But it was real, and real was something we had not reliably had before. Viridian Systems was acquired 8 months later. The acquirer was a logistics infrastructure company based in Atlanta that had been watching Simone's platform for 2 years and finally moved when they realized waiting any longer was going to cost them more than buying. The deal closed on a Thursday afternoon. Simone called me from the parking lot outside her attorney's office, and I could hear in her voice that specific combination of exhaustion and relief that only arrives at the end of something that required everything a person had. She said, "Your number is going to hit your account by end of week." The final figure on my Viridian stake after fees and taxes was $11.3 million. I added it to the spreadsheet I had been keeping since I was 23, updated the net worth total, and sat at my kitchen table for a while without doing anything in particular. The east-facing window was dark by then. The neighborhood outside was quiet. I was 31 years old and I had built something real from a standing start with no inheritance, no safety net, no family connection that had ever worked in my favor, and no one in the room telling me I was capable of it. I thought about Ruthann Okafor's kitchen table in Plaza Midwood. I thought about chicory coffee and Saturday mornings and a woman who asked me what I saw instead of what I had scored. She had been gone for 4 years by then, and I had not been able to tell her about Irongate Advisory or Viridian or the article or any of it, and that absence sat with me on that Thursday evening the way it always did, as a specific and unresolvable weight. Some things you want to report back on and you never get the chance, and you learn to carry that alongside everything else. What I could do was build something that she would have recognized. Something that reflected the things she had tried to teach me at that kitchen table, which were patience and rigor and the understanding that the value of a thing is not determined by who notices it but by what it actually is. Irongate Advisory had 23 active clients by the end of that year. We had expanded into a second market in the research triangle. Dex had been promoted to associate director and had hired 2 analysts of his own, both of them young and sharp and slightly underestimated by their previous employers, which I had started to realize was a quality I selected for without entirely meaning to. I had dinner with Colton the following spring at a restaurant he chose in Plaza Midwood, which I took as either coincidence or something deliberate that he hadn't said out loud. We talked for 3 hours. He told me about the pressure he had grown up carrying, the weight of being the one the family had decided would succeed, and how that weight had functioned less like a gift and more like a set of expectations so specific that there had never been much room inside them for him to figure out who he actually was. I told him about the years of watching from the outside and the discipline it had required to turn that position into something useful rather than just something painful. We were learning each other in the way that people learn each other when the version they were given at the beginning turned out to be insufficient, which requires starting over with better information and considerably more honesty. My mother and I had lunch every other week. It was not the relationship I had wanted as a child. It was more careful than that, more deliberately constructed, with less assumed and more said out loud. She asked me questions about the business now. Real questions, not polite ones. She had started reading the Charlotte Business Journal, which I learned because she occasionally referenced articles I hadn't read yet. I did not make a thing of it. I just answered her questions and let the new version of us take the shape it was going to take on its own schedule. My father and I were still in process. That is the most accurate way to say it. The engagement at Morrow Fabrication had created a professional relationship that gave us a container for contact that neither of us had to emotionally negotiate from scratch every time. We talked about the business. Sometimes the conversation moved into adjacent territory, careful and imprecise, the way conversations do when two people are trying to find language for something that has not been said directly before. It was not repaired. It was repairing. That distinction mattered to me. What I understood by the end of all of it, in a way I had not understood at the beginning, was that the story my family told about me had never actually been about me. It had been about what was convenient for them to believe at a time when looking clearly would have required them to change something. People construct narratives about the people around them that serve the life they are trying to maintain, and those narratives can persist for decades past the point where any honest assessment would have revised them, because revision is costly and dismissal is cheap. I had been the cheap option for 20 years. And then I had become undeniable. I did not become undeniable for them. I became undeniable for myself, one careful decision at a time, in the privacy of my own life, long before anyone was paying attention. The number in the article was just the moment it became visible to people who had not been looking. The actual work had been happening for years in spreadsheets and deal memos and Sunday mornings at a kitchen table in Plaza Midwood where a woman with chicory coffee told me to pay attention to what I saw. I paid attention. That is the whole story. And if you are somewhere on the outside of a family that decided what you were before you had the chance to find out yourself, I want you to know that the outside is not the worst place to build from. Sometimes it is the only place honest enough to work in. You do not need their permission to become what you already are. You just need to keep going long enough for the truth to become undeniable. Keep going. And so can you. If this story made you feel something, don't just scroll away. There are so many stories out there that never get told, and here on Confira Stories we bring them to life. So if you enjoy emotional real-life drama like this, take a second to subscribe and be part of the journey. And if you've ever been in a situation like this, or have a story of your own, share it in the comments. I read them. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.